The interviewer asked, "Why did Pope Francis choose him? An American? A missionary? A man no one expected?" The Swiss guard didn't answer right away. He just reached into his coat and placed a sealed envelope on the table. "It wasn't a choice," he said. "It was a memory, and it was never meant to be opened while Francis was alive." So, what was inside that letter? Before we reveal what he wrote, hit subscribe and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. It wasn't Vatican TV. It wasn't a political channel. It wasn't even scheduled. But the broadcast began anyway, right on the hour across European networks, with a red "Live from Rome" banner pulsing on screen. The camera settled on a man in uniform, not the usual cassock or cardinal robes. Instead, it was the unmistakable dark blue tunic of the Pontifical Swiss Guard, off-duty but not informal. A former corporal, recently retired, his posture still military, and his nameplate below the screen read Luca Bianchi, former Swiss Guard. The host offered him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Corporal Bianchi, thank you for joining us." Luca nodded once. He looked older than his 38 years, like the weight of standing silently for nations had etched itself into his skin. "Tonight's interview is historic, not only because you served Pope Francis personally for nearly a decade, but because you were on duty the night he passed, and also during the final moments of the conclave." Luca didn't speak. Not yet. And yet she added, "There's one more reason your presence has drawn such attention. It's not just where you stood, but what you received. A letter from Pope Francis himself, delivered into your hands and kept sealed until now." The host leaned forward. "You've declined every media request until tonight, even turned down the BBC. Why now?" Luca finally moved. A deep breath. Then he looked straight into the camera, eyes clear as alpine ice. "Because for 10 years I stood and said nothing. Because sometimes tradition demands silence. But tonight," he paused, voice steady as a cathedral wall, "I am not speaking for myself. I'm speaking because he asked me to." "You mean Pope Francis?" "No," Luca replied. "Not just him." The host spoke carefully. "You're referring to Pope Robert Prevost?" Lucas's gaze held unwavering. "I'm referring to what he represents." Cut to black. A Swiss guard speaks about the new Pope Robert Prevost. What he reveals is... Before we reveal what happens next, press the subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. It had been the quietest night Luca Bianchi could remember in a decade of service. Not the ceremonial kind of quiet where tourists lowered their voices, but the deeper quiet, the kind that comes before something ends. The Domus Sanctae Marthae was always still after dusk. But that night, the Vatican residence seemed frozen. Guards spoke in glances. No one knew exactly how close the Holy Father was to his final breath, but everyone sensed it. Luca's final shift began at 2000 hours. He had requested it personally. Francis had once nodded toward him during Easter Vigil and said, "You're the only one who prays louder inside than out." Luca never forgot those words. That night there were no visitors, no cardinals pacing outside the Pope's door, only the rhythmic shuffle of nurses and the quiet hiss of oxygen. Francis hadn't asked for last rites. He hadn't asked for readings. He hadn't even asked for company. Just one thing: presence. When Luca entered the Pope's antechamber, he saw him not in his bed, but in a chair, a blanket across his knees, a rosary in one hand. Their eyes met. "Gracia, mio," Francis whispered. Luca said nothing. He only bowed his head and took his post, 2 paces behind, 1 meter to the right. Like always, for 2 hours, nothing happened. At one point, the Pope looked toward the window and whispered something. In Spanish, La casa se está apagando. The house is dimming. Shortly before midnight, Francis's aide entered the room and exchanged a long glance with the Pope. Then he stepped toward Luca and handed him a cream-colored envelope, wax-sealed. This is for you directly, not to be opened until the white smoke rises. Luca blinked. For me? The aide nodded. He said you would understand. Luca took it. The weight wasn't in the paper. It was in the trust. At 1:37 a.m., Pope Francis was pronounced dead. Luca remained at his post for another hour. He didn't cry. He didn't pray out loud. He just stood like the church was leaning on his shoulders and didn't know it yet. It wasn't until he returned to the barracks that he placed the letter in his footlocker, still sealed, still waiting, because that's what guards do. They wait until the right moment, and then they move. It was just after 6 p.m. when the bell above St. Peter's began to toll. White smoke had risen from the Sistine Chapel chimney. Inside the barracks, no one spoke the new pope's name aloud, but it passed in silence through brief glances and hurried movements. Luca was stationed just outside the apostolic palace when the smoke turned. Within seconds, the square exploded into noise. Cheers, prayer shouted in a dozen languages, cell phones raised to capture the moment. But inside the Swiss Guard command post, a strange tension settled. It wasn't joy, it wasn't grief, it was confusion. Because while the world celebrated a new pope, the men tasked with guarding him were hearing a name they hadn't expected. Prevost. Luca heard it first from Sergeant Yulee, muttered under his breath like a question. American. Someone else replied, That's what they're saying, from Chicago, Augustinian. Another added, Mission work in Peru. Not even a cardinal last year, someone else chimed in. He wasn't on any short list. Luca didn't speak. He simply listened. The guard was trained to be still amid uncertainty. But this wasn't uncertainty. It was disbelief. An American. In centuries of papal conclaves, no non-European had ever risen to the papacy without political orchestration. Even Francis, for all his surprise, had been whispered about for years. But this was different. Prevost wasn't just outside the curial circle. He had lived most of his clerical life in places without cameras. Luca returned to his post. The crowd below was surging now. Tens of thousands pressed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the first glimpse of the 267th successor to St. Peter. A senior officer passed behind him, preparations in motion, name confirmed. Robert Francis Prevost. Luca didn't blink, but inside, the name echoed. He remembered the envelope, the sealed envelope still waiting in his footlocker. After the white smoke, the aide had said. As the band prepared for the announcement, Luca excused himself briefly, citing a uniform adjustment. He walked quickly to the barracks. He opened his locker. There it was, still sealed, still heavy. He tucked it into his coat and returned to formation. Because sometimes you don't open a letter when the moment tells you to. You open it when the world needs to remember who sent it. That evening, the Vatican had changed. Not visibly. Not yet. The banners hadn't been hung and Robert Prevost had not yet appeared on the loggia, but beneath the surface everything was different. It was Luca's commander, Captain Rinman, who found him by the chapel doors just before midnight. The captain was a man of rigid posture and few words. Luca, come with me. They moved through the stone corridors in silence, past the armory, past the command office, until they stopped outside a room rarely used. An old debriefing chamber turned archive. Inside was a simple table, one chair, a lamp, and the envelope. Luca stepped in, closed the door behind him. The captain remained outside. Luca sat down, removed his gloves, held the envelope in his bare hands. It was addressed to him. Not to the College of Cardinals, not to the new pope, not even to the commander. Just to Corporal Luca Bianchi. After the white smoke, he broke the seal carefully. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, handwritten, no letterhead, no date. The first line read, "You saw me only in silence. That is why I trust you to carry this." Luca read on. Francis recounted a moment from long ago, not in Rome, not even in Europe. It was a flood zone in northern Peru, San Jose de Amuco, a remote parish half swallowed by rain and mud. Buildings collapsed, the chapel roof torn off, a relief team delayed by bureaucracy. And there, amid the chaos, was a younger Robert Prevost. No entourage, no cassock, just rolled-up sleeves and bare feet lifting an elderly woman out of waist-high water, carrying her on his back through wreckage to shelter. No press was there, no photographers, only one Argentinian archbishop visiting from Lima, a man named Jorge Bergoglio. "I watched from the hill," Francis wrote. "He did not know I was there. That is when I decided." Luca paused. Francis continued. "He knows what silence demands. He does not speak loudly, but he listens louder than most men pray. He has carried what others flee." At the end of the letter, Francis had written, "They will ask how I could trust an American. Let them. They did not see what I saw when the waters rose." Luca folded the letter carefully. He just sat there, the paper resting on the table, and understood. This wasn't an endorsement. It was a memory. A memory Francis had kept sealed in ink and silence until the world was finally ready to hear it. Luca didn't speak of the letter for weeks. Not to his commanding officer, not to his fellow guards, not even to the priest who heard his confession each Saturday beneath the frescoed dome of San Damaso. It wasn't that he feared reprisal, though there would be some. It was that he knew instinctively what the letter was. Not a document, a burden. Still, it had done something to him. Unlocked something behind his ribs where duty and faith intertwined like old roots. He started replaying conversations in his head, moments with Francis that hadn't made sense until now, like puzzle pieces finally finding their place. The Pope had always walked differently through the Vatican. Less like a monarch, more like a man who knew his time was borrowed. Luca remembered once during a guard shift on Holy Thursday how Francis had paused as he passed, hand resting briefly on Luca's shoulder. "Silenzio non è l'assenza di parole," he'd said in Italian, eyes warm but tired. "È la presenza di peso." Silence is not the absence of words, it is the presence of weight. At the time, Luca hadn't understood. Now he did, carrying his own weight beneath his uniform. He also remembered the rumors that had floated through the guard barracks in Francis's early years. Some said the Pope's humility made him naive, that refusing the apostolic palace was a publicity move, that eating in the Domus cafeteria with ordinary priests was a charade for the cameras. Luca had believed none of it. But even he hadn't expected this, that the man who washed prisoners' feet had also quietly been shaping a succession that would outlive the smoke and applause, not with handshakes in corridors of power, but with memory, with witness. What struck Luca most about the letter wasn't the flood or the old woman or the dramatic rescue. It was the line that followed. He fixed the mission school with his own hands for 6 weeks. He never asked the dicastery for funds. He didn't want Rome to know. That was the sentence that stopped Luca cold, because in the Guard, the men who talked the least always stood the longest. Francis knew that too. The letter went on. You cannot build a church if you are afraid to sweat. He rebuilt that school barefoot with students beside him. No interviews, no ribbon cutting. And when I asked why, he said, because they had nowhere to go, and the rain would come again. That phrase haunted Luca. The rain would come again. Because in the Vatican, storms didn't always make noise. Sometimes they came quietly in the form of opposition, resistance, delay. Francis had known that, and he'd chosen Prevost, not for charm, not for diplomacy, but because he had already survived the flood. Luca read the letter 3 times that night. By dawn, he had memorized most of it, words branded onto his heart like an invisible oath. What stayed with him wasn't the authority granted, it was the tone. There was no pride in Francis's voice, only a quiet ache, as if writing the letter had cost him something, as if knowing the truth wasn't enough. Someone had to carry it. And Francis had chosen a man in red and gold trim, standing silent in a corner hallway. Not because Luca had power, but because he had eyes, because he saw, and because perhaps more than anyone else in the Vatican, he knew what silence meant when the weight was real. The letter didn't stay secret for long. Luca never said a word. But in the Vatican, silence travels faster than speech. A courier saw the envelope being handed to him. A secretary noticed his absence during morning inspection, and by the following Friday, a bishop from the Congregation for Bishops casually asked if the Swiss Guard had taken an interest in ecclesiastical correspondence. Luca responded with the same neutral nod he gave tourists outside St. Peter's Square, the perfect blend of acknowledgement and nothing at all. But the messages kept coming. They weren't orders, not officially. They came wrapped in small talk, hidden between lines of protocol, gentle suggestions that drifted his way like leaves on a Roman breeze. Of course, said one archbishop from Florence, sipping espresso in the Curia courtyard. The Swiss Guard must be impartial. Their oath demands it. Another, a French cardinal with perfectly manicured hands, leaned in during a chance hallway encounter. The Holy Father admired your professionalism, Luca. Don't jeopardize that by wandering into theological waters. Leave the succession to the shepherds. Even his direct superior, Commander Reichenbach, pulled him aside one morning near the armory. You've been seen with Bishop Prevost before the conclave, he said, tone matter of fact. That will attract questions. Luca offered no defense, just stood at parade rest, eyes fixed on a point 6 inches above the commander's head. Reichenbach sighed. I'm not accusing you of anything. Just remember what our job is. We guard the living pontiff, not the memory of the last. That one stung more than the others. Cut deeper than any formal reprimand could have, because Luca didn't see it as nostalgia. He saw it as unfinished duty, a torch still burning in his hands. He hadn't spoken publicly, but already they were treating him like he had. Like words not yet uttered were already echoing through sacred halls. Whispers about overreach. Comments in the mess hall that a guard shouldn't concern himself with letters or conclaves. Or apostolic legacies. As if he were meddling in matters beyond his station. As if knowing something had become a crime. And for a time, Luca considered their warnings. He was no theologian, no journalist with press credentials. He'd trained with rifles, not microphones. What business did he have carrying messages between popes? Then he remembered another night. Not the night of the letter, but before that. Francis had just returned from a hospital visit. It was nearly midnight. The Pope had passed Luca alone in a domus hallway, moving slowly, his gait uneven from the sciatica that troubled his later years. He had paused, eyes finding Luca's in the dim corridor light. "You know," Francis said softly, "I used to think silence was strength." Luca remained motionless, unsure if the Pope was speaking to him or himself. Then Francis turned, his weathered face half in shadow. "But sometimes, my son, silence is cowardice, especially if truth is buried underneath it." The Pope didn't wait for a response. He just continued on into the dark, his cassock whispering against the floor tiles. Now, in the days after the conclave, that memory played louder in Luca's head than any threat. The interviews, the pressure, the polite attempt to contain him within the boundaries of his oath. He wasn't seeking headlines. He didn't want a stage, but Francis had asked him to speak, and Prevost, humble, uncelebrated Prevost, had carried a weight most men never touched. If Luca stayed silent now, he'd be complicit in the erasure of a choice that wasn't political, wasn't diplomatic, but profoundly human. And so, for the first time since laying down his halberd, Luca Bianchi made a decision that wasn't covered by his oath. He would speak. Not to journalists hunting for controversy, not to critics seeking ammunition, but to the people. Because someone had to say what really happened and why it still mattered. Back in the studio, the interview had stretched past its second commercial break. But viewers weren't leaving. Social media was already lighting up with clips, with questions, with theories about what this former guard might reveal. Luca Bianchi sat under the lights like a man holding an invisible weight. The host, a seasoned Vatican journalist named Elena Grimaldi, had done dozens of these interviews. Cardinals, theologians, even visiting heads of state. But tonight, she kept her voice lower, her questions slower. She knew this wasn't just a man telling a story. This was a man deciding if he would break a vow. "So why now, Signor Bianchi?" she asked gently. "Why this interview after weeks of silence?" Luca looked down. His hands were folded on his lap, just as they had been at the start. But now they trembled slightly. Not with fear, but with the tension of centuries of tradition pressing against the present moment. He exhaled slowly, gathering himself. "Because the question isn't who we chose as Pope," he said finally. "It's whether we truly understand why." Elena paused, then leaned forward slightly. "You were with Pope Francis in his final days. You were on duty when the conclave concluded. But tonight, you've hinted there was something more. Something before the conclave that few have spoken about." Luca nodded slowly. "There's something I've never told anyone. Not my commander. Not even the guard chaplain." She gave him space to continue, sensing the importance of what was coming. "It was 4 days before the conclave," he said, voice steadying like a boat finding calm water. "The Holy Father asked me to walk with him in the gardens. No entourage, no cane, just the two of us. He said he wanted to feel the gravel under his shoes one last time. Said it reminded him of Buenos Aires." Elena waited, pen still in her hand. "We reached the edge of the olive grove. He stopped, put a hand on my shoulder and said, 'They will ask why I chose an American. Tell them I didn't.'" A flicker of confusion crossed Elena's face. "He didn't choose Prevost?" "No," Luca replied, eyes now fixed on hers. He chose a witness. He let the silence settle between them, heavy with meaning. I asked him what that meant. He said, "Because the church doesn't need another diplomat right now, or another caretaker. It needs someone who has known the smell of blood and dust." Luca shifted in his seat. I didn't understand then, not fully, but now I do. Elena whispered, "What did he mean?" "That a shepherd must know what wounds look like up close. That leadership isn't built in palaces, but in flood zones, hospice rooms, prison chapels." He reached into his jacket and pulled something from the inside pocket. A photo. Worn edges, folded 3 times. The kind that's been carried, not displayed. He handed it to her. In it, Prevost stood knee-deep in muddy floodwater, cradling a child in one arm and steadying an old man with the other. No robes, no clerical collar, no cameras, just presence. "He gave me that after the conclave," Luca said softly. "Didn't explain?" "It. Didn't need to." Elena looked at the photo again, then back to Luca, understanding dawning in her eyes. "And you believe this is what Francis saw? This is why he wrote that letter?" Luca nodded. "I believe Francis knew the next pope wouldn't be understood, so he left someone behind to explain it." The interview aired on a Wednesday evening. By Thursday morning, the Vatican's Public Affairs Office had logged more inbound emails than any day since Pope Francis's death. The switchboard operators took turns answering calls from media outlets around the world, all asking for the same thing: verification, context, meaning. Luca Bianchi hadn't gone home after the broadcast. He'd walked the perimeter of the city-state twice. Out of habit, maybe, or nerves. The rhythm of footsteps against ancient stone. When he finally returned to his modest flat behind the guard armory, the messages had already started piling up like autumn leaves. The first was from a priest in Nebraska. "I never saw Prevost as more than a transitional pope. After tonight, I see a bridge instead of a placeholder." Then came another from a Carmelite nun in Cork. "He came to our hospice last Lent. No press, no handlers, just him and a thermos of tea. He held the hand of a dying woman for 3 hours. Now, I understand." More followed. Hundreds, thousands, lay people, seminarians, retired bishops who hadn't given interviews in decades. Even a few skeptical cardinals wrote quietly, discreetly, their words careful but curious. One message simply read, "The silence was finally explained. Thank you." And yet, not all responses were warm. A few conservative blogs condemned Luca's appearance as unauthorized revelation. One Latin American cleric posted that the Swiss Guard should remain ornamental, not political, but the tides had already turned. That weekend, crowds doubled at Prevost's morning mass. The man who had been described in early reporting as too quiet suddenly stood at the center of the world's most important conversation. But Prevost said nothing about the interview. No statement, no rebuttal, no confirmation. He just kept doing what he had always done, visiting prisons, writing personal letters to sick parishioners, refusing red carpet appearances that his predecessors had embraced. When asked by a Reuters journalist if he'd watched the interview, Prevost smiled and said, "I've always believed silence speaks for itself." But inside Vatican corridors, everything changed. The air moved differently, currents shifting beneath marble floors. The Congregation for Bishops began receiving appointment requests from dioceses that had once resisted reform. A seminary in Lagos submitted a surprise recommendation for a rural priest who'd served during Ebola. Uncredentialed, but beloved. Prevost's choices are reaching farther now, one senior Vatican advisor said off the record, because now people finally see what Francis saw. The Swiss Guard received its own flurry of attention. Young recruits quoted Luca's interview in training. One corporal printed out the transcript and taped it beside his bunk. Because now we're not just guarding history, he said. We're part of telling it. Luca, for his part, didn't speak publicly again. He declined further interviews, politely refused book offers, ignored requests for op-eds and panel discussions. Instead, he spent most days walking the outer gardens, usually around dusk when the tourists had left and the shadows lengthened across gravel paths. Always alone. But sometimes he carried letters. On one afternoon, he visited the post office tucked inside the Vatican walls and mailed a stack of handwritten responses. Not many, just a dozen, all addressed in the same steady script that had once logged security reports. One was to the hospice nun in Cork, another to a theology student in Manila who had written, "I used to think humility wasn't strong enough to lead. Now I'm not so sure." Luca added only one sentence to the reply. Strength that doesn't speak is often the hardest kind to recognize. By the end of the month, the interview had quietly become the most watched Vatican broadcast in over 5 years. It didn't trend. It didn't go viral. It simply stayed. Stayed in inboxes, stayed in sermons, stayed in conversations, whispered in pews and behind chancery doors. Because when a Swiss Guard speaks, not out of defiance but out of duty, people listen. The Vatican gardens were nearly empty that morning. The sun had barely crested the dome of St. Peter's. When Luca Bianchi stepped onto the gravel path, his civilian shoes crunching softly beneath him, the jacket he wore was plain charcoal gray, collar folded down. Not the proud red and blue stripes that once made tourists reach for cameras. Those days were behind him now. He passed a blooming camellia tree and paused briefly near the olive grove where Pope Francis had once walked with young pilgrims. That day had been windy. The flags had refused to stay still. Francis hadn't minded. "Let them dance," he'd said. "They're only fabric." Now silence held the grove like a sacrament. Luca continued walking until the chapel came into view. It was small, tucked behind a hedge near the edge of the garden. Not the Sistine, not the grand basilica, just a quiet place where popes went when they didn't want to be seen. Inside, the air was cool and fragrant with old wood and candle wax. And there, alone in the first pew, sat Pope Robert Prevost. No cameras, no aides, no script, just the man, his folded hands, and the soft flicker of sanctuary light on his face. Luca didn't approach. He didn't need to. Prevost turned slightly, sensing his presence. Their eyes met for only a moment across the chapel's hushed interior. A nod passed between them. Nothing more. But that single motion carried the weight of everything. Trust, understanding, and the unspoken bond of those who had both stood still when it mattered most. Luca stepped quietly to the chapel rail and reached into his coat pocket. He drew out a small, worn object, a rosary. The beads were dark wood, smooth from years of use, the kind given to him during his third Easter rotation by Francis himself. Not for display, the old pope had said, pressing it into his palm. For memory. Luca placed it on the rail gently, as one might return a family heirloom. Then he turned and walked back into the garden, his steps slow but steady. No one stopped him. No one needed to. By the time he reached the outer path, the sun had risen just enough to catch the rooftops in a golden glow. Bells began to toll faintly from the basilica, a sound older than kings, echoing off cobblestones smoothed by centuries of faithful feet. Luca looked up at the sound, feeling it reverberate in his chest. He had done what he was entrusted to do, not as a soldier, not as a spokesman, but as a witness. And in a world full of noise and spectacle, that was enough. Would you have trusted a pope, chosen not for politics, but for the weight he carried in silence? And should the Swiss Guard ever speak about what they witnessed behind closed doors, or should that loyalty remain unbroken forever? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. If this story gave you a deeper respect for the silent men who stand guard, not just at palaces, but beside history itself, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon on so you don't miss tomorrow's story. We upload daily stories about royal guards, Swiss guards, and the sacred weight of duty when no one is watching. And if you know someone who thinks these guards are just for show, share this video with them. Let them see what real service looks like under pressure. Our other Royal Guard stories are appearing on your screen now. Tap 1 to keep watching. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another story that proves silence isn't weakness, it's conviction.